They boarded the plane without me, and I never called them. I stood there at gate C12, my carry-on still in my hand, watching the final boarding group disappear down the jet bridge as if I had imagined the last 2 hours entirely. The announcement echoed overhead, calm and indifferent. Final call for Flight 287 to San Diego. And I waited for my son's voice, for Daniel to turn around, to realize I wasn't behind him, but he didn't. No one did. I checked my phone once. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing. Just the time staring back at me, 9:42 a.m., like it had nothing to do with me being left behind. I remember how excited I had been just that morning, standing in my kitchen before sunrise, double-checking my suitcase, making sure I packed the small gifts I bought for my grandchildren. Seashell necklaces from that little shop downtown, the one Ashley said they would love. I even packed snacks for the flight, the kind Daniel used to ask for when he was little, thinking maybe, just maybe, we would share a quiet moment together at 30,000 feet. But at the airport, something had already felt off. Ashley held all the boarding passes, smiling that polished smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Daniel stayed close to her, nodding along to everything she said, barely looking at me except to ask if I had my ID ready. We moved through security like a unit, but not really together. I noticed it then, the way they walked just a step ahead, the way conversation stopped when I came close. At the gate, Ashley said something about checking with the agent, and Daniel followed her without hesitation. I stayed with the bags like I always did, like I had done for years, holding things together while everyone else moved forward. Minutes passed. Then more. I assumed they were handling some issue with the tickets, maybe a seat change, maybe something minor. I wasn't worried. Not yet. Then I heard it, the boarding announcement. Group A. Then Group B. Then C. I stood up, scanning the crowd for Daniel's tall frame, for Ashley's blonde hair, but all I saw were strangers lining up, handing over their passes, stepping into a future that apparently didn't include me. I walked to the counter, my heart steady, my voice calm. "Excuse me," I said. "My family stepped away with our boarding passes." The agent glanced at her screen, then back at me with a look I couldn't quite place. "Ma'am, your party has already boarded." I nodded as if that made perfect sense, as if families left each other behind every day. I stepped back, letting the next passenger move forward, and I returned to my seat. I didn't run after them. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Ashley. I just sat there, hands folded over my purse, listening to the hum of the airport, realizing that sometimes the loudest truth is silence, and theirs was deafening. I remained seated long after the gate area had emptied, long after the final boarding call faded into the background noise of rolling suitcases and distant conversations, and for the first time in many years I allowed myself to do nothing at all, no fixing, no calling, no explaining, just sitting there as the realization settled quietly into place, not like a storm but like a slow, steady weight pressing down on my chest, because what had happened was not loud or chaotic, it was precise, intentional, and almost polite in its execution. And that made it harder to ignore, harder to excuse. I looked down at my ticket, the one Ashley had handed me earlier without much explanation, and for the first time I noticed the details I had overlooked before: a different boarding group, a seat assignment that did not match the ones Daniel had mentioned when we first talked about the trip, and a departure time that had already passed by nearly 20 minutes. I turned the paper over in my hands as if it might change if I looked at it long enough, as if there had been some mistake made by the airline. Something simple and fixable, but deep down I already knew better, because I had seen the way Ashley avoided eye contact when she gave it to me, the way Daniel had checked his watch twice without saying a word, the way they both moved with quiet urgency that did not include me, and suddenly the small moments from earlier that morning began to line up in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Ashley insisting on handling all the travel arrangements, Daniel telling me not to worry about the details, the quick exchange between them near the check-in counter that stopped the moment I walked up. I had told myself it was nothing, that families get busy, that young people move fast, that I was simply not keeping up, but sitting there alone with a ticket that led nowhere, I could no longer soften it into something harmless. A gate agent passed by and gave me a brief, sympathetic glance, the kind strangers offer when they sense something is wrong but do not ask questions, and I appreciated that more than I expected, because I was not ready to explain this, not even to myself. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone again, not to call them, but to look at the screen as if it might hold an answer. Still nothing, no apology, no confusion, No message saying they were looking for me, and that silence was louder than anything they could have said. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, how he used to hold my hand in crowded places, how he would panic if he could not see me for even a moment. And I wondered when that had changed. When the distance had grown so wide that he could walk onto a plane without once turning around to check if I was behind him. I folded the ticket carefully and placed it back into my purse, my movements slow and deliberate, because I understood now that rushing would not change anything, that whatever this was, it had been decided long before we ever reached the airport. I stood up, smoothing the front of my coat, and for a brief moment I considered going to the counter, asking for help, trying to catch a later flight to join them, but the thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, because if they had wanted me there, they would have made sure I was not left behind, and I was done pretending otherwise. I walked slowly toward the large windows overlooking the runway, my reflection faintly following me in the glass, a woman standing alone in a place designed for movement, for departures, for families walking side by side toward the same destination. And yet I stood still, separated not by distance but by intention, because the more I replayed the morning in my mind, the clearer it became that nothing about this had been accidental. Not the ticket, not the timing, not even the way Ashley had gently placed her hand on Daniel's arm when I asked a simple question about the gate number, redirecting him before he could answer. I remembered that moment now with uncomfortable precision, how he had hesitated for just a second, just long enough to show that something was off, and then nodded as if he had agreed to something I was not meant to hear. I had dismissed it at the time, like I had dismissed so many small things over the past few years, the quiet changes that never seemed important enough to confront, like the holidays that became shorter, the visits that became less frequent, the way Ashley always seemed to be the one deciding what was best for everyone, including me. I leaned lightly against the cool glass and watched a plane taxi across the runway, wondering if they were on it, if Daniel was sitting by the window scrolling through his phone, or if Ashley was already planning the itinerary without ever mentioning my name. And what unsettled me the most was not anger, but the absence of surprise, because somewhere deep down, I had felt this shift coming, not as a single moment but as a pattern, a slow erosion of place and presence. I thought about last Christmas, how Ashley had called 2 days before to say they were keeping things small this year, just immediate family, her voice warm and apologetic, and how I had spent that day alone with a reheated dinner, telling myself it was understandable, only to later see photos online of a full table, laughter, neighbors, friends, everyone included except me. I had told myself then that it was a misunderstanding, that these things happen, but now, standing in an airport with a useless ticket and an empty phone, I could no longer pretend that these were isolated incidents. They were connected, each one a quiet step leading to this moment. I straightened my coat and exhaled slowly, feeling something inside me settle into place, not breaking, not collapsing, but shifting into something steadier, something clearer, because for years I had adjusted myself to fit into the spaces they left for me, smaller and smaller each time. Accepting less, expecting less, telling myself that love sometimes looks like patience, but this was not patience, this was removal, deliberate and clean, and the realization did not make me cry, it did not make me raise my voice or demand answers, it simply made me understand, and understanding has a way of changing everything. I reached into my purse once more, not for my phone this time, but for my wallet, sliding it open with calm hands, because if they had already decided I did not belong on that plane, then I would decide what came next, and for the first time since the announcement at the gate, I was not waiting for anyone to come back for me. I walked toward the information desk without rushing, my step steady, almost measured, as if I had all the time in the world, because in that moment I realized that time was the one thing no one could take from me, not Ashley, not even my own son. The woman behind the counter greeted me with a polite smile, the kind that is trained and practiced, and I returned it just as calmly, asking about later flights, not with urgency, not with panic, but with quiet curiosity, as though I were simply adjusting a minor inconvenience. She typed for a moment, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, then looked up and explained the options, flights leaving in 3 hours, 5 hours, even the next morning, and I nodded, thanking her, but I did not book anything, not yet, because I needed to be certain about something first. I stepped aside and sat down again, pulling out my phone not to call Daniel, but to open the airline app to check the reservation details myself, something I had not done before because I trusted them, because I believed that family did not require verification but trust. I entered the confirmation number printed on my ticket and waited as the screen loaded. And when it did, the truth appeared in a way that was simple, clean, and impossible to misunderstand. My reservation was separate, booked under a different itinerary, a different departure time, a different seat class, everything about it distinct from the one Daniel had described weeks ago when he said we would all be flying together. I stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because I did not understand but because I did completely, and that clarity carried a weight that pressed quietly against my chest. This had been arranged in advance, not decided at the gate, not a last-minute confusion, but planned, confirmed, and executed without a single word to me. I thought about the evening Ashley had insisted on handling all the bookings, how she had smiled and said she would take care of everything so I would not have to worry, how Daniel had agreed so easily, almost gratefully, as if removing me from the details made things simpler, and now I understood what simpler meant to them. It meant separate, it meant out of the way. I locked my phone and placed it back into my purse, my hands no longer trembling, because the uncertainty that had filled the past hour was gone, replaced by something far more solid, something that did not need to be questioned or interpreted. I looked around the terminal again, noticing details I had ignored before: families gathered around charging stations, couples sharing quiet conversations, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, all of them moving together with an unspoken understanding that they belonged to one another. And for a brief moment I allowed myself to feel the absence of that, not as a wound but as a fact, like the temperature outside or the time on the clock, something that simply was. I stood up once more, this time with purpose, and walked back to the counter. The same woman looked up at me, her expression unchanged, ready to assist, and I met her gaze with a calm that surprised even me, because I was no longer deciding how to follow them. I was deciding something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with catching up or being included. Something that began with understanding that I had already been left behind long before we ever reached this airport. I asked for a hotel near the airport, nothing fancy, just somewhere quiet, somewhere clean, somewhere that did not require explanations, and the woman behind the counter printed out a small list with directions and phone numbers, her voice steady and neutral as she circled one option that offered a shuttle every 30 minutes. I thanked her, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into my purse as if it were something more important than it looked, because in a way it was the first decision I had made that day that belonged entirely to me. I walked toward the exit, past the sliding glass doors that opened and closed with a soft mechanical rhythm, and stepped into the cool air outside, the kind that wakes you up without asking permission. The shuttle arrived within minutes, and I climbed aboard with two other passengers who did not look at me and did not need to, because we were all just travelers moving between places, carrying our own quiet stories. I chose a seat by the window and watched the airport fade behind me, the runways stretching out like long gray lines, the planes lifting into the sky one by one, and I wondered if Daniel's flight had already taken off, if he had settled into his seat, if Ashley had leaned over to say something that made him smile, and the thought came and went without staying, like a passing car on the highway, because something inside me had already shifted beyond that kind of wondering. The hotel lobby was bright and impersonal, polished floors, soft lighting, a front desk clerk who greeted me with the same practiced kindness I had seen all day, and I checked in without hesitation, using my own credit card, signing my own name, watching the receipt print with a sense of quiet clarity, because for years I had shared everything: accounts, decisions, responsibilities, always believing that together meant secure. But now I understood that together had slowly turned into something else, something that no longer included me in the way it once had. My room was on the 4th floor, overlooking the parking lot, nothing remarkable, just rows of cars and the distant outline of the highway. But when I closed the door behind me, the silence felt different from the silence at the airport. It was contained, controlled, almost peaceful. I set my suitcase on the bed and opened it slowly, not because I needed anything right away, but because I wanted to see what I had packed, what I had prepared for a trip that I was no longer taking. The small gifts for my grandchildren were still neatly arranged, untouched, waiting for a moment that would not come, and I stood there for a long second, looking at them, not with sadness, but with a kind of understanding that felt deeper than disappointment. I placed them back carefully and zipped the suitcase closed, then sat down in the chair by the window, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my mind moving through memories not as a flood, but as a sequence, each one clearer than the last: the holidays, the missed calls, the decisions made without me, the polite excuses that always sounded reasonable on the surface, and I saw it now not as separate moments, but as a pattern that had been building for years. And the airport had simply been the place where it became impossible to ignore. I reached for my phone again, not to check for messages because I already knew there would be none, but to open something else, something I had not looked at in a long time, my financial accounts, the documents my late husband had organized so carefully before he passed. And as the screen lit up, I felt that same steady calm settle over me again, because if they had made their decision about where I belonged, then it was time for me to make mine, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be announced to be powerful. I sat there for a long time with the soft glow of the phone screen lighting my hands, scrolling slowly through accounts and documents that I had not needed to question for years, not because they were unimportant, but because I had trusted that everything was as it should be. My late husband had always been meticulous, organized in a way that felt almost excessive at times, every account labeled, every document filed, every detail explained to me more than once, as if he knew that one day I would need to understand it on my own. And as I moved through the information now, I began to notice something that made me pause, not a dramatic discrepancy, not something obvious, but small shifts, transfers that had been redirected, permissions that had been updated, access points that had changed quietly over time. I leaned back slightly in the chair, holding the phone steady, reading each line again, slower this time, because this was not confusion, this was intention, and I could see the pattern forming with the same clarity I had felt at the airport, the same quiet precision. I remembered the conversations Ashley had initiated months ago about simplifying things, about making it easier for Daniel to help manage certain responsibilities, her tone always polite, always framed as concern, and I had agreed without hesitation, signing forms, updating access, believing that I was making things easier for my son, that I was preparing for a future where I might need help. But now, looking at the screen, I understood that those changes had not been neutral, they had been strategic, subtle enough to avoid attention, gradual enough to seem natural, and effective enough to shift control without confrontation. I set the phone down for a moment and looked out the window again, the parking lot now darker as the afternoon moved toward evening, the steady flow of cars replaced by stillness, and I felt something settle inside me, not panic, not even anger, but a recognition that everything was connected, the distance, the decisions, the quiet removal from plans, and now this, the slow repositioning of control. I reached for the phone again and opened the account details one more time. This time not as someone trying to understand what had happened, but as someone deciding what to do next, because the truth was no longer something I needed to uncover. It was something I needed to respond to, and I knew exactly who to call, not Daniel, not Ashley, but someone who had been there long before either of them had stepped into these decisions, someone who understood the structure of everything my husband had built. I searched through my contacts and found the name I had not used in years, the attorney who had helped us organize everything, who had once sat at our kitchen table explaining how each piece was meant to protect me, and I stared at the name for a moment before pressing call, listening as the line rang once, twice, 3 times, and when his voice answered, older but still steady, I spoke calmly, clearly, not rushing, not explaining everything at once, just enough to begin, because I did not need to raise my voice to be heard, and I did not need to confront anyone to take back what had quietly been shifted away from me. I only needed to act, and for the first time that day, I felt something that had been missing since I stood at that gate, not relief, not comfort, but control returning in a way that was quiet, deliberate, and entirely my own. His voice did not change when I explained what I had found, not in surprise, not in disbelief, just a quiet pause on the other end of the line, followed by a single question that felt heavier than anything else he could have said. When were these changes authorized? And I gave him the dates, reading them directly from the screen, each one tied to a memory I had once considered ordinary, a lunch at the house, a conversation at the kitchen table, a moment when Ashley had slid a document toward me with that same calm smile, and said it was just a formality, just something to make things easier, and I had signed without hesitation, trusting not the paper, but the people sitting across from me. He listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for a detail, a name, a confirmation, and I answered each one with the same steady tone I had found earlier, because I was no longer trying to piece together what had happened, I was documenting it, and there is a difference between confusion and clarity that you can feel in your voice, even if you do not say it out loud. When I finished, there was another pause, longer this time, and then he spoke carefully, choosing his words in a way that told me he understood exactly what this meant, not just legally but personally. He explained that the changes were significant, not irreversible but deliberate, that they had shifted access and control in ways that could be challenged, reviewed, corrected, but only if I chose to act, and I found myself nodding, even though He could not see me because the choice was already made. I was not calling to understand my options, I was calling to begin. He suggested we meet in person, review everything together, go through each document line by line, and I agreed without hesitation, setting a time for the following morning, my voice calm, my words simple, as if I were scheduling something routine, and when the call ended, I placed the phone gently on the table beside me and sat back in the chair, letting the silence return, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but structured, like a space that had been cleared for something new. I looked around the room again, the neutral colors, the neatly made bed, the closed suitcase, and I realized that nothing here belonged to the version of the day I had expected, and yet it felt more honest than anything I had left behind. I stood up slowly and walked to the mirror near the door, not to adjust anything, not to check my appearance, but simply to look, and the woman staring back at me did not look lost, she did not look abandoned, she looked still, composed, aware in a way that I had not been that morning. I reached for my coat and draped it over the chair, then returned to the window, watching as the last of the daylight faded into a soft gray, and I thought about Daniel again, not as the boy who once held my hand, but as the man who had walked onto that plane without turning around, and for the first time I did not search for reasons, I did not excuse it, I did not soften it into something easier to accept, I simply acknowledged it for what it was, and in that acknowledgement something else settled into place, something quieter, stronger, because if they had been willing to move forward without me, then I would move forward as well, not toward them, not to rejoin something that had already excluded me, but in a direction that was entirely my own, one that did not require permission, explanation, or inclusion, one that began with understanding exactly where I stood, and choosing finally to stand there without stepping back. The next morning arrived without urgency, without the rush that usually follows uncertainty, and I woke before the alarm with a clarity that felt unfamiliar but steady, the kind that does not come from rest but from decision. I moved through the room slowly, deliberately, folding the clothes I had not worn, placing each item back into my suitcase with the same care I had used when I packed them, not for a trip now, but as a way of putting things back in order. I paused when I reached the small gifts again, the seashell necklace is still wrapped in tissue paper, and for a moment I held one in my hand, turning it gently, remembering the way I had imagined their faces lighting up, the small excitement of giving something thoughtful, and I realized that the intention behind those gifts had not been wasted. Even if the moment had been taken away, I placed them back just as carefully and closed the suitcase, then dressed in the same calm silence, choosing simple clothes, nothing that required attention, nothing that suggested anything other than a normal day, because that is what this was now, not a disruption, not an interruption, but a continuation, just in a different direction. I checked out of the hotel with the same quiet efficiency I had checked in, the clerk wishing me a pleasant day without knowing that the day had already shifted in ways that could not be seen. The drive to the attorney's office took about 20 minutes, the roads familiar, the traffic light, the world moving as it always did, indifferent to personal moments of change, and I found comfort in that, in the steadiness of everything outside of me. The building itself looked exactly as I remembered, the same brick exterior, the same glass doors, the same small plaque beside the entrance, and as I stepped inside I felt no hesitation, no second guessing, just a quiet sense that I was exactly where I needed to be. He greeted me in the lobby, older now, slower in his movements, but his presence unchanged, grounded, attentive, and he led me into his office where the air felt still, contained, a space designed for clarity, for decisions that required thought rather than emotion. We sat across from each other at a large wooden desk, and I placed my phone and documents in front of him, not dramatically, not with emphasis, just setting them down as one would set down facts, and he began to review them, line by line, his expression focused, occasionally asking a question, confirming a detail, and I answered each one without hesitation, because there was nothing left to interpret, only to confirm. Time passed quietly, measured not by the clock but by the turning of pages, the clicking of a pen, the occasional note written in the margin, and when he finally looked up at me, there was no confusion in his eyes, no uncertainty, only a clear understanding of what had been done and what could be undone. He explained the steps calmly, the adjustments that could be made, the protections that could be reinstated, the authority that could be returned, and I listened, not overwhelmed, not rushed, simply absorbing each word as part of a process that had already begun the moment. I chose not to call anyone at that gate, and when he finished I did not ask for time to think, I did not ask what I should do, I simply nodded, because the decision had already been made long before I walked into that office. It had been made in silence, in observation and understanding, and now it was just being carried out with the same quiet certainty. By the time I stepped out of his office, the world looked exactly the same street, the same passing cars, the same people walking by without noticing anything unusual, and yet everything had shifted in a way that could not be seen from the outside. I paused on the sidewalk for a moment, adjusting my coat, not because I needed to, but because I understood that this was a point of no return, not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet line that had already been crossed. The documents were no longer uncertain, the permissions were no longer in question, and the structure that had been slowly altered without my awareness was now firmly back in my hands, not as a reaction, not as a punishment, but as a correction, a return to what had always been intended. I walked toward my car with steady steps, the sound of my heels against the pavement sharp and consistent, and for the first time since that morning at the airport, I allowed myself to think about what would happen next, not in detail, not as a plan to confront or explain, but as a simple unfolding of consequences, because actions, no matter how quietly they are taken, always carry weight, and that weight does not disappear just because no one speaks about it. I knew that at some point Daniel would notice, perhaps not immediately, perhaps not until he needed access to something that was no longer available to him, perhaps when a transaction did not go through, or a document required authorization that he no longer had. And in that moment there would be questions, confusion, maybe even frustration, but I would not be there to answer them in the way I once had. I would not soften the edges or explain things away to make them easier to accept. I would simply remain where I now stood, clear, steady, and no longer adjusting myself to fit into decisions that excluded me. I reached my car and opened the door, placing my purse on the passenger seat with the same care I had used all day. And as I sat behind the wheel, I glanced at my phone one more time, still silent, still unchanged, and that silence no longer felt heavy, it felt appropriate, like a space that no longer required filling. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, merging into traffic without hesitation, moving forward in a direction that did not need to be explained to anyone else. Because for years I had believed that staying quiet meant keeping the peace, that adjusting meant preserving the relationship, but now I understood that silence can also be a boundary, and distance can also be clarity. I did not need to call them to tell them what had changed. I did not need to announce what I had done or why, because the truth would reveal itself in its own time, in the absence of access, in the absence of control, in the absence of the quiet permissions they had come to rely on. And when that moment came, I would not need to say anything at all. I would simply continue forward, just as I had done when I stood at that gate and chose not to follow, because they had left me behind once, and without realizing it, they had also left behind everything they thought they could quietly take with them.